Democracy is the type of government in which people choose their leaders by voting, and capitalism is an economic and political system in which a country's trade and industry are controlled by private owners for profit rather than by the state.
North America. Mexican-U.S. War. Cause. In 1836, Texans declared its independence from Mexico, and Texan defenders of the Alamo are all killed during the battle by the Mexican army. On April 21st, Texans defeated Mexicans at San Jacinto. Development. 1846. U.S. declares war on Mexico in effort to gain California and other territory in the Southwest. After a bloody war, Mexico recognizes Rio Grande as new boundary with Texas, and for $15 million agrees to give the territory that present day is California, Nevada, Utah, and most of New Mexico and Arizona, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. War concludes with signing of Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. Consequence. By the end war, Mexico lost nearly half of its territory, the present-day American Southwest. From Texas to California and the United States became the continental power. American Civil War, 1861-1865. Cause. With the election of Abraham Lincoln, the 7 states of the South refused to take him into account as a president. Development. The country was divided into 2 parts: the Confederate States that wanted state rights and slaves, and the Union that wanted freedom, civil rights, and were against slave ownership. The American Civil War was a bloody struggle. The Confederate forces surrendered on April 9, 1865. The United States remained united, one nation indivisible. Consequence. The Civil War was confirmed the single political entity of the United States, led to freedom for more than 4 million enslaved Americans, established a more powerful and centralized federal government, but freedom did not lead to equality for former slaves. It initiated immense constitutional changes that redefined the nature of American society and acted as a point of departure in the struggle for equal civil rights and human rights. The Spanish-American War, 1898. Causes. The main cause is the Cuban struggle for independence from Spain, which began in February 1895. Spain's brutality, repressive measures to halt the rebellion were known by the U.S., and American sympathy for the rebels rose. Development. On April 25, 1898, the United States declared war on Spain in representation of the threat of Spain towards Cuba, following the sinking of the battleship Maine in Havana Harbor on February 15, 1898. The war ended with the signing of the Treaty of Paris on December 10, 1898. Consequence. As a result, Spain lost its control over the remains of its overseas empire: Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippine Islands, Guam, and islands. The U.S. gained more power. General conclusion. All of the historical facts we've talked about led to one conclusion: that thanks to them in the present day, they have the most organized countries and the democracy as well, because everybody in that region is able to express their opinion and ask for what they want towards their government and way of living. In the capitalist aspect, their economy is one of the most powerful one in the world, and it's always seeking to stay on top. And with all the historical events, there has been ups and downs, but still forms part of what the region is today.
Mexico's independence. In only 11 years, the insurgent army ended almost 3 centuries of Spanish domain. Everything started on the morning of September 16, 1810. All the Mexican people, accompanied by Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla, started walking around the streets screaming, and that day the war started. The causes were that they wanted to end with the Spanish domain and wanted to forget about the whole concept of viceroyalty. The consequences were that a lot of wars started because of the different ideas to rule the country. In this part of Mexico's history, the capitalism didn't increase because of the Spanish monarchy. They had a lot of market in England, America, and France, and they didn't want it to stop it. But democracy increased when the independence in 1821 ended, because finally, after a lot of years, they were free from the Spanish people. Constitution of 1824. It was made by a Constituent Congress of Federalists on October 4, 1824. It said that Mexico was a federal republic, the unique religion accepted was the Catholic, Mexico was free and independent from Spain, It will be divided in three powers: legislative, that was formed by a Senate and a Chamber of Deputies; executive, formed by a president and a vice president; and judicial, formed by a Supreme Court. The president will always be elected by vote. The causes were that they wanted to have a democratic government, the people wanted to have freedom to choose the president they wanted to, and they wanted to have some order in the country. The consequences were that Guadalupe Victoria was elected as president, the country started to organize, and they started having more freedom.
It contributed to democracy because it was the first document that said how the country was going to be organized and all the rights that people had. And it also contributed to capitalism because it wasn't just an economic system but a political system which protects and develops the Constitution. Treaty of Guadalupe was a treaty where Mexico and United States signed the peace. The treaty consisted of giving the USA the northern part of Mexico, Texas, California, New Mexico, Utah, and Colorado, and because of that, USA would pay $15 million. The causes were that Mexico and United States had a war, and Mexico loses. So United States demanded to accomplish the Treaty of Guadalupe to sign the peace. The consequences were that USA converted in the most powerful country in America. It didn't contribute to democracy because the USA government forced the Mexican government to sell them the northern part as a sign of peace while Mexico didn't want it to lose territory.
Independence from Spain and Portugal 1906 to 1998. The Napoleonic invasion of Spain, more than a cause, was an excuse. Most of Latin America declared independence from Spain in 1910. By 1925, Mexico, Central and South America were free. Spanish rule in the Americas ended in 1998 when they lost their final colonies to the United States following the Spanish-American War. The consequences were that the young American republics were free to find their own way, but this process was always difficult and often bloody. The most devastating war ever fought in South America was the War of Triple Alliance in 1864 to 1870, pitted Argentina, Uruguay, and Brazil against Paraguay. When Uruguay was attacked by Brazil and Argentina in late 1864, Paraguay came to its aid and attacked Brazil. Ironically, Uruguay, then under a different president, switched sides and fought against its former ally. When the war was over, hundreds of thousands had died and Paraguay was in ruins. It took decades for the nation to recover. The Cuban Revolution 1953 to 1959. When Fidel Castro attacked the barracks at Moncada in 1953, he may not have known he was taking the first step to one of the most significant revolutions of all the time, with the promise of economic equality for all. The rebellion grew until 1959, when Cuban President Fulgencio Batista fled the country and victorious rebels filled the streets of Havana. Castro established a communist regime, building close ties to the Soviet Union. Ever since, Cuba has either been a festering sort of totalitarianism in an increasingly democratic world. In conclusion, Latin America increased its level of democracy because most of the countries got independent.
Congress abolishes the African slave trade. The U.S. Congress passes an act to prohibit the importation of slaves into any port or place within the jurisdiction of the United States from any foreign kingdom, place, or country. The first shipload of African captives to North America arrived at Jamestown, Virginia in August 1619. But for most of the 17th century, European indentured servants were far more numerous in the North American British colonies than were African slaves. However, after 1680, the flow of indentured servants sharply declined, leading to an explosion in the African slave trade. By the middle of the 18th century, slavery could be found in all 13 colonies and was at the core of the Southern colonies' agricultural economy.
By the time of the American Revolution, the English importers alone had brought some 3 million captive Africans to the Americas. Anglo-Zulu War. Foreign settlers first came into conflict with the Zulu in the 1830s as they began expanding into Zulu territory. For the majority of the next 40 years, there was a tentative peace among the British and the Zulu. The Zulu relationship continued to be one of great friction from the Battle of Blood River in 1838. To Boer, inquisitions and infiltration of land recognized by the British to belong to the Zulu leading into the 1860s. The British supported the Zulu cause against the Boers and supported the Zulu leader during his coronation in 1873. Assume this support will continue when the British took control of the Transvaal in 1877. However, the British proved to care more. The First South African War. The British success in removing much of the native problem from the borders of the Boer Transvaal had united adverse consequences. The removal of British focus from its Boer issues allowed the Boers to concentrate on the continued British control of the Transvaal. General Wolseley was openly against any notion of Boer independence and issued statements that gathering in protest of the British rule could lead to precautions for treason. The Boers continued to push for their independence, to the point that the Boer leader, Paul Kruger, who had intentionally preached caution against rushing to fight, began accepting that war was inevitable. The Anglo-Zulu War didn't have any impact in the democracy or capitalism. However, the First South African War did. Unable to get more involved in a war that was a loss, the British government of William signed a truce on March 6 in the final peace treaty of March 23, 1881, granted self-government to the Transvaal Boers under the British theoretical supervision. And as in the slave trade, it had a democratic impact as to no longer be slaves, they had the right to choose for themselves.
Napoleonic Wars. Cause. A huge cause of the Napoleonic Empire was the French Revolution. The country was unstable and in need of leadership came through as an opportunity for Napoleon. Development. The Napoleonic Wars were a series of battles during the Napoleonic campaigns in France during 1789 to 1821. With brilliant military strategies, overthrew the French Directory and proclaimed himself as a first consul and later on a dictator. Consequences. The wars caused millions of deaths, and a result of the Napoleon conquering most of parts of Europe, it left unresolved issues between the countries that later on caused wars. Opium War, 1839-1842. Was caused directly by China's isolationist trade policy with the West, because China would only accept silver from the British. Tension arose quickly between the two countries. Development. British merchants began smuggling opium into China in order to balance their purchases of tea for export to Britain. Consequences. This resulted in a treaty that opened 5 new ports in China to trade with the West. Trade taxes were also limited to 5%, and the Chinese now had to accept the concept of extraterritoriality. Boer War, 1899. Causes rooted in long-standing territorial disputes and in friction over political rights for English and other Uitlanders. Development. The Boers were the descendants of the original Dutch settlers of the southern Africa. Britain took possession of the Dutch Cape Colony in 1806 during the Napoleonic Wars, sparking resistance from the independence-minded Boers. Minor fighting with Britain began in 1890s, and in October 1899, full-scale war took place. Consequences. In 1910, the British created an independent union of South Africa, which combined the old Cape Colony and the Boer Republic. The new state would be self-governing nation within the British Empire. Europe conclusion. To summarize, all of these events led to a capitalist government, and if it didn't show back then, now the democracy is present because the people in Europe have freedom and the right to choose what they want. So these historical events helped the formation of a capitalist and democratic region for the most part.
Middle East. The Safavid Empire, 1501-1629. Causes. The areas around Persia and to Central Asia declined to anarchy, so the Safavid dynasty took over. They became Shias. Development. Shah Ismail used his forces to seize much of Iran and Iraq. Then he called himself the king of a new Persian state. Ismail sent Shia preachers into the Anatolian Peninsula to convert members of Turkish tribes in the Ottoman Empire. Later, he ordered the massacre of Sunni Muslims and he conquered Baghdad. Consequences. As a result for this fight for territory and the conquer with religion and territory, these regions now have a mixture of cultures and beliefs as well as ports in Asia. But the forced adoption of a religion brought problems to the reality they are living now. First European involvement in the Middle East, 1798. Causes. During a Napoleonic expedition to Egypt, they wanted to deliver a blow to Britain's Indian Empire by conquering Egypt. Development. Britain sent their navy to the eastern Mediterranean and destroyed a French fleet. French defeated in Alexandria Mameluke cavalry. Later, only concluding with a treaty with Turkey and restoring Egypt's control, they gained forces again. Consequences. French military only lost power, and they realized Egypt was under good conditions of defending themselves. Another consequence was that Middle East was into another threat for imperialism and expansion. Kahar ruled in Persia, 1794-1925. Causes. In Persia, the rise of the new Kahar dynasty led to the increasing European involvement. This eventually brought the country to a state of economic submission to Russian and British interest. Development. In 1905, a Persian revolution took place, but it broke out even when the responsible Muhammad Ali Shah tried to get involved. Sometime later, they fought together with Russia. Britain and Russia divided Persia. Consequences. Internal conflicts within Persia led to the growing Russian domination of the country until World War I. All of these events caused at some point imperialism, even if there was no complete conquer. The dynasties didn't impose democracy or capitalism either. In Middle East, the self-defense was vital. The economy wasn't distributed well, and the lack of freedom caused the disrespect of many ideologies. Qing Dynasty, 1644 to 1911. Causes. It got on the top because of the economic chaos the Ming had caused. It was believed that the Ming had lost the mandate of heaven. That was the belief that heaven selected the emperor. This encouraged people to rebel and encouraged the Mongols and Jurchens to attack. Development. Abahai changed the dynasty title to king and moved the capital to Shenyang. Qing is the last feudal dynasty in Chinese history. In the Qing's declining period, China entered the semi-colonial and semi-feudal society, due primarily to colonial intrusions. The territory grew rapidly. Qing government implemented several agricultural problems, such as regarding land cultivation and a reduction in taxes. As a result of these innovative changes, the early days of the Qing dynasty witnessed an unprecedented period of prosperity. Consequences. It brought much significance of many impacts to the modern China, also to the traditional Chinese culture, and it brought the unity of 56 ethnic groups.
Modernization of China. Between 1860 and 1895, Chinese people wanted to restore the country. The causes were that the new army of China was full of new ideas and they had a lot of communication with Europe, so they wanted to be as modernized as them. The consequences were the caste, a rupture in the cultural way. It contributed to democracy because they did what they wanted with their country, and it also contributed to capitalism because they said capitalism wasn't just an economic system, it was also a form of life, and they used that form of life to modernize their country. Boxer Rebellion. In 1898, the Chinese people were really unhappy because Europe wanted to interfere in the political and economical things in China. So Chinese people wanted to take out the European people from China. The causes were that they weren't happy with the economy and political interference of Europe, and the consequences were that the Qing dynasty began to fall. It didn't contribute to democracy because Europe took advantage of China.
In conclusion, China developed a very rich culture but by being isolated from other countries.